Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, and what an amazing start to the morning. Thank you so much for that session, for sharing your thoughts. And I thought yesterday was great as well. I was able to speak to some of you over dinner, and I found the speakers, especially the poets, absolutely mind-blowing. Um, well, when I told my team I was coming to speak at an early childhood development conference, when they picked themselves up from the ground from laughing, they said, "But what do you know about this area?" I said, "Yeah, I'll give you the email address of the organizers and you can ask them." So, so if after my talk you're still going, I still don't get it, that makes two of us, okay? Yeah. But thank you. I couldn't say no to coming to Cape Town. So the answer was yes. And then I said, "What do you want me to talk about?" So, so if he shows in the session, that will be why, okay? Um, uh, I'll be reflecting on some of my work, which you heard Nicole talk about in the introduction, but also be drawing from my other experiences, not just as someone who works for business. I'm also a volunteer in various NGOs and organizations in the UK. I worked for many years for a youth leadership charity, ISEC. I was based in Nigeria, where I'm from originally, and then took postings in former Soviet Union, in Estonia, in Latin America, in Brazil, and then ran ISEC in Africa, based in the Netherlands. I'll be drawing from all of those experiences, including in my job today, working in the UK, what's considered to be the heart of capitalism, Tesco, the UK's biggest supermarket. I'll be reflecting all of those, but I'll be speaking on a personal capacity. That way I can say exactly what I think, yeah? And not have to clear it with corporate affairs, okay? So I wanted to start with the future in mind. And I think the first connection I saw between this subject and my area is that early childhood development and sustainability also think about the future. We start building from imagining the future. And I thought a chunky, far away enough, but imaginable future to start with was 2050. So I thought about the African Union Summit in 2050, and I thought it should be held in this city. Who knows this city, Umeasiegbu city? Yeah, nobody lies here because this city does not exist yet. And I'll come to, when you meet someone you've never met and you say, "Wow, there you are." And they say, "Yeah, I was thinking the same." No, you weren't, you've never met. Now, 2050 is not that far away. And so the point I wanted to draw out is that some of the delegates that will be attending that session, or the civil servants that will brief them at that session, are already born. Maybe some of them might be in this room already. It's not that far away. Yet it's far enough that the world will change fundamentally to the one we recognize today. And so I'll share with you my thinking of what might be on the agenda of the African Union Summit in 2050, and then I'll say what I think might be missing, and that would be a real shame. These are the things I think might be on their agenda, and all of them are important. They'll be thinking about population growth. They'll be thinking about urbanization, resources stress. They'll be thinking about new technology, an example you've heard already this morning. And then they'll be thinking about that need for the emotional support seal, which will be the result of a rise of individuality versus community. This ought to be on their agenda, and what you might notice that might be missing explicitly is the environment that will host all of these. And for good reason. They have only a few days and they can't cover everything. And that's what happens, that sometimes the most important thing that ought to be the starting point is missing. Now, let me say a little bit about some of those issues that they'll be dealing with. Population growth, 101% increase in Africa's population between now and 2050. Yeah? To 2.53 billion people. 26% of all of humanity will be in Africa by 2050. Yeah? I think very interestingly for me is that 1.3 billion of them will live in urban areas. Yeah? In cities like Umeasiegbu City, which has not yet been built. 700 million people will live in cities that don't exist today. 33 years from now, 10 times, 11 times the entire population of South Africa will live in cities that have not yet been built. I'll pause for a second so you take that in. South Africa, 11 times. We'll find somewhere to fit them on this continent. Now, it won't be evenly spread. It will have implications that touches on everything. Most of these people, more than half of them, will come from West Africa, Nigeria, for instance, yeah, which is also already quite a densely populated part of the world. So the children of the future in South Africa will be dealing with their neighbors, being refugees, immigrants, economic migrants from all over the continent. Europe is still dealing with people from the Middle East turning up, and a few people turning up in a few boats. There'll be 700 million in cities, a lot of them looking for somewhere to go, because some of those cities will not be cities. There will be informal settlements. There will be unplanned neighborhoods, and people will be pushed by the needs that they see to find lives elsewhere. Today, I think less than 500 million, just to give you some data, live in cities. Now, these will be the national priorities those governments will have. Of course, there will be public health implications, which is understandable. How do you make sure these people are looked after? The outbreaks of diseases similar to Ebola or cholera or anything else, public health concerns are taken care of. There'll be issues with transport. You know, someone was telling me this morning about how long it can take to drive from one place to the other in Cape Town. If you've been to Los Angeles, it's the same thing. Now imagine having 700 million people. And the good news in that is that a lot of them will have increasing prosperity. Their income will be increasing, so they can afford cars or bicycles. And then they'll go on roads that yet are to be built. Transport will be a big issue. Energy will be a big issue, and there might be good news stories there. There'll be waste. How do you manage waste and so on? And then there'll be questions of food security. Now, that will combine with a number of other things, which I'll come to in a second, to exacerbate the problem a little bit more. Now, when it comes to resource stress, this is what will be happening to the natural environment. Today, we're losing about 50 football fields per minute globally of forest cover. So by the time the talk is finished, we would have lost thousands of square meters of forest around the world. Now, today it's agriculture, and that's one of the issues I deal with, because we source in our business about 350,000 tons of soy, which is used to feed the livestock that we sell to our customers, 350,000. And most of that is grown in Brazil, in the neighborhood of the Amazon. That's one of the things that's driving deforestation in Latin America. In Africa, it's wood fuel that's driving it. Now, the technology, the good news we'll have is that the technology will be there to slow down deforestation for wood fuel in Africa. But urbanization will need a place to go, either to get the resources to build the homes or actually the space to build them. And the top hotspots for us will be these places. And of course, I don't need to tell you about the impacts on biodiversity loss and so on and so forth. I thought, because I'm African, I can afford to depress you a little bit before I go to the solutions, right? Yeah. Someone else says, if you say, well, who are you to tell me these things? But yeah, I can say it. I'm also part of the problem. And I thought to use another example. What might be happening to our seas? Now, there will be, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, by weight, there will be as much plastic in the ocean as fish. Actually, their worst-case scenario is that there will be more plastic in the sea than fish. Actually, the reason is this, that since we invented plastic, every single piece of plastic ever made is still around. Every single straw you've used for that martini or whatever, or orange juice, every single stem of the pen you've used, every single Tupperware plate, every single piece of plastic ever made is still around. And most of them make their way into the sea, where organisms mistake them for jellyfish and consume them, or others ingest them accidentally. and others break down. It doesn't stay as plastic. In the heat of the sun in the open sea, it breaks down into its constituent parts and it makes its way back into the food chain. And today in the US, 80% of everybody from 10 years or above has tested positive for ingestion of plastic. Of course, they didn't chew and eat themselves. They consumed food that had fed on plastic. And that's the impact today. We expect that it will grow in future. That's the sort of environment that we'll be talking about, but it won't be on the agenda of the African Union meeting in 2050 because there are so many other more urgent, pressing issues. And they'll come to this when they've dealt with the others. The challenge is with environmental problems, if you don't start on time, you won't be able to get on top of it. And many would argue we don't actually have that time anymore, even now, even 33 years from now. What about climate change? I hadn't talked about climate change. I've talked about marine. I've talked about forests. For those economies that are built on agriculture in the UK, in Africa, I'll give you a number of statistics. They expect there to be about 15 to 30% reduction in economic output by 2100 in Africa. That is at a time the population is going up. We'll be having up to 30% reduction in food output. And what was interesting for me were the actual food groups that were going to be hit. So by 2050, just as a result of climate change, there'll be 23% less wheat production on the continent. And this one, the next one is important to me, 13% less yam and sweet potatoes, 8% less cassava, 5% less maize, 1% less rice. Now, these are not scary figures until you put them side by side, a 101% increase in population. Yeah? I'll start with the good news now. There will be a 0.5% increase in millet production, 1% increase in sorghum. We have to make sure it doesn't go to alcohol production, so people at least get something to eat. So fruit and vegetable production, we did a piece of research 4 years ago, which we haven't published, by the way, so don't tweet this bit. And we looked at our fresh produce supply chains, and particularly one fresh produce product sourced from one African country. And we saw from the modeling that it was in 10 years' time, that was 4 years ago. So 6 years from now, there are 3 months of the year when we spend the most money in this country for this produce, their production will be hit by more than 50%. And that's the funny thing about climate change. It's not going to cause the things to collapse overnight. And therefore, like the frog in a cold water bath that you slowly turn up the heat, it'll be some months might be off, and then the other month picks up, and then some month might be off, the other month picks up. And even in my organization, I speak to buyers, they say, yeah, the yield of citrus from this country has gone down. I don't know if it's a one-off or it's a pattern. And I speak to their predecessor, they say, yeah, I had the same. I don't know if it was a one-off or a pattern. I spoke to their predecessors, yeah, I saw the same. You know the drill. Now, they stay enrolled 2 years each, and so they move on to other things. And so you can't blame them for not knowing if it was a one-off or a pattern. So currently my team has chosen the top 20 most important products in our supply chain, and I've asked them to backcast as far as we can find data and plot the graph for me so that I can know if this thing is really a one-off or a pattern. And so that is going to be a very big issue. And of course, you've seen partly what happened in Syria. Some of them, the urgency of people leaving their homes is driven, yes, by conflict, but also driven by the fact that they couldn't actually stay in the refugee communities due to lack of water brought on by drought and climate change. But there are good news stories as well. Technologies will be addressing some of these problems that I've just listed. Some of it will be the issue of wood fuel, like I've said. A lot of very simple technology will reduce the dependence of rural communities on wood and charcoal to cook. And that will be a very big impact, both on health and, of course, on the climate. And let's not forget, the reason we're going to have a 101% population growth is a good news story. It's because fewer kids are dying in childbirth, because people are growing into adulthood and so on. There is also a good news story attached to it. Africa is seeing the biggest drop in fertility rates around the world. So it's not going to continue to be bad news. It's just how do we manage this moment when it peaks and then starts to stabilize? How do we make sure that we don't repeat the errors of the West, where our natural resources are completely destroyed by the time we peak and start stabilizing, that we have those natural resources that we can live in. So it's not just bad news, there's also good news stories. And we must prepare for it, of course. The fact that we have the foresight that Europe didn't have when it chopped down its forests means that we can do something with this information. And renewables and electric vehicles, which I'll use as a case study in a moment, are examples. But you have to think, what happens to Nigeria when everybody drives cars that you can charge at home? What happens to Angola when most people have solar panels above their homes? How do you manage those economies that are completely dependent on petroleum? And of course, how do you manage those economies who are also dependent on agriculture or on tourism when they lose their forests and their biodiversity? So these are the things we ought to be thinking about between now and 2050, and definitely we must make sure the civil servants who brief those delegates who go to the African Union Summit are thinking about it as well. Building tomorrow's environment. So I wanted to turn to steps to action. And I wanted to make it 10 because 10 sounded like a good number, but I ran out of ideas at 8, so bear with me. I thought I would split some of them into points, but I thought you would find out. Yeah. Now, the first thing was, what are the issues? How do we understand what the issues are? And that's pretty straightforward. I've shared some of them with you. I should say, what are the opportunities as well? It's not just a matter of issues. What are the things that will emerge in 33 years that we ought to start thinking about, working towards addressing right now? And which of these must we address now? Someone talked yesterday about sequencing. You know, when we go after chasing the elephant, not the mice, which ones do we address and which ones must we address now rather than the ones that can wait till later? And then who has the expertise? Who can help us solve this problem? And are they in the room? Who is best placed to lead the charge? I put that differently because sometimes it's not the person with the expertise that's best placed to lead the charge. Sometimes you need someone who understands political realities to lead the charge and have the scientists feed the data. And then what could be the benefits and obstacles? And which other voices are influential? And how can we, the people in this room, the people who know, the people who can influence action, how can we stimulate action? And I thought I'd use a case study of an example in the UK just to bring that to life a little bit more. First, just to give you a sense of the UK's carbon emissions, this is how it breaks down. So emissions from the UK as a whole, transport emissions rank amongst the top 3 as an emission source. Now, the UK government introduced the UK Climate Change Act a few years ago, and that has enabled it to have a very focused approach to addressing climate change. It started first by addressing the power sector, introduced incentives like feed-in tariffs to stimulate the economy to enable people switch to renewable